name is Grace, and you're listening to the Homebody Podcast. Welcome, everyone. Today's episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about story and stories and how our relationship to stories creates our understanding of what time it is, what now means, and what our role in that is. Stories are something that humans love. In a way, I think stories are human behavior. And I'm not going to get too deep into this particular what is a story today because it's a topic I'll explore in an upcoming episode with a guest. But today I want to look at stories in two ways. One is that stories are lenses. Stories are lenses through which we see life, sort of like glasses. We all have stories through which we are looking at reality. That's it. And we're all seeing and experiencing life through a story. There are no exceptions to that. No one is seeing reality objectively because none of us is the totality of the monad. And like I talked about in an earlier episode called From Judgment to Mystery, there's something simultaneously humbling when we realize that we are looking and experiencing reality through a story. We're experiencing life through a story. But I think there's also something very powerful about that as well, something deeply creative. Because if it is a story, then it's one that we can develop skill with. It's something that we can get more present with. It's something that we can update. It's something that we can get better at telling, better at writing, or better at speaking. I think in addition to being lenses, stories are also magnets, repelling some things and pulling in other things, matching with certain things that fit into the story and rejecting or not even noticing things that don't fit into the story. Stories are magnets. The more we have a story, the more we collect evidence that backs up our story, the bigger our backpack gets with that evidence, and the more we see that story reflected out into the world. It becomes this feedback loop. The story finds the data, fills the backpack. The bigger the backpack, the more sure we are that this is the story, because we have a backpack full of evidence. I was teaching a yoga class here in Atlanta a few weeks ago, and something that really arose for the group was the sense that a lot of the things that a lot of healers and coaches, practitioners that I know, the things that we're seeing the most in people right now is, of course, anxiety, overwhelm, and this story of worthlessness is essentially what it is, but the sense that you're not good enough. And I talked about this in the RIP Good Girl episode as well. But let's say that there is some story that you're not good enough, and that's the lens through which you see the world. And for a lot of people, they have this story, but it's unconscious. They're not aware that this program is what's playing, and that there is a character inside of them looking at life and experiencing life, collecting a bunch of evidence that they're not good enough, or they're not worthy, or that X will never happen to them, or they don't deserve Y. And so whenever something arises that lights up that story, activates it, the first thing that people do is look in their backpack and say, see, I have all of this evidence. I'm so sure I'm not good enough. We do the same thing with our anxiety or any of our feelings and our sensations. Stories are embodied things. They inform our embodiment. In somatic world, there is a saying that says story follows state. And I think it can go both ways. I think state can follow story as well. But in that sense, it's describing a relationship between what our body can handle and the kind of story that we have. If our nervous system is rigid, if our nervous system doesn't have a wide riverbank with a wide range of possible sensations, feelings, spectrums of interpretation, then our story will also be very rigid, very small, and quite sure in its smallness as well. And as we create more flexibility in our system, the more creativity, the more flexibility, the wider our lenses can get, the wider our story can get to include more things about life and reality, and therefore include us in it. We can also be included in more of reality and life the bigger our story gets. And I'm saying this, stories are lenses, stories are magnets. I think stories are many things. To point to the importance of the story that you're telling yourself, the world, about your life, about what is happening, about where you're going, about where it is going, that really matters. Not only in that it's important, but that I think it creates matter, if for no one else, for you. The story you tell about what is happening, who you are, where you're going, what now is, that matters. And in this great reasonable age that I think we are at the peak culmination of, I think we're watching the culmination of many things, the age of reason as everything being one of them. And in that, one of the symptoms, I think, of quite a soullessness or a malaise that we can see in the wider culture is this overall sense of skeptical cynicism. There's sort of this unspoken association between being smart and being intellectual, with being pessimistic, with being cynical, with being skeptical. And if we go back to the phrase, story follows state, or state creates story, or story informs state, whatever that feedback loop acknowledgement is, telling a story that is pessimistic and cynical, dualistic, is one of the easiest stories to tell. It is the easiest story to tell. That's why we see it everywhere. Not necessarily because it's true, but because it's easy. It's easy to say, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. It's easy to say, it's about good versus evil, and obviously we're the good ones and the other people are the evil ones. It's easy to be pessimistic. It's very easy to look. There's plenty of suffering and tragedy and violence in the world to feed that story. But there's also enough beauty and joy and compassion in the world to feed another story. When our nervous system is overwhelmed, when we're in collapse, and we're feeding ourselves the story of cynical, fearful, dualistic pessimism, it feeds that collapse. It feeds that overwhelm, and we start digging our little tunnel and filling our backpack with all the things we're so sure make it absolutely the right time to be in despair. But it's just a story. It's just a story. It's just a lens. And there's plenty of other and wider evidence out there to say otherwise. So be aware that when we're slipping into collapse and overwhelm and we've got the world on our back and all we're seeing is all the violence, all the suffering. So we have to be aware that this is what's happening, that our imaginal world is part of what's co-creating our reality. How we are feeding the backpack with our evidence that fuels our story is a very powerful thing that we do. And the more spiritual prowess we get, the more awareness that we build, the more we can become conscious creators of what's going in the backpack and what that evidence tells us. And also, I think it can unlock a deeper creativity and a responsibility, a willingness to want to bear the burden of telling the story about life. The whole true thing, as you see it, that is beautiful. But yes, there is also suffering. That is feeling like a peak right now. But honestly, it feels like an insult to magic and all that is great and holy when we're just so sure we already know what's happening. I was sharing in a ceremony call earlier this year, a few weeks ago, trying to describe time as something that is alive. Time is a moving, writhing thing. I see time as a great snake, a great serpent. And it's willowing this way and that way, slithering this way and that way. And as it moves, it's got its belly on the ground, and this skin is coming off and new skin is coming on. It's consistent, but it's also changing. And not only is it changing, it's also moving and writhing around. Time is a moving thing. And so if the story isn't changing, then we're not being current with time. Time is not fixed. Time is not set. The story is not already decided. The story is a writhing, alive, dancing, breathing snake. And so the more skillful we get with our energy, with our spiritual practice, with our creative practice, and get more agency and access not only to life, but to our life, we are able to dance and ride with that snake and even become that snake of life, of time, something that is not fixed, something that is moving and changing and beats in time. Now is the seed for next. Now is the seed for next. We love to fix things. I do as well. It's a habit. We see something. I think it's our nature as well. It makes us good improvers. It makes us good evolvers. It makes us adaptable to change. We love to fix a thing. But the story isn't always broken just because you don't like it. Now is the seed for next. When we think about change, we tend to narrow it down. We tend to oversimplify so that it can become something we can fix. We're so sure that if we can just fix this one character flaw that we have, we're so sure if our partner would just see it our way instead of the other way, or they would stop doing this annoying thing. We're so sure if, society could just make this choice instead of that choice. We're so sure if your neighbor would just move, or if you could just be in another city, or if you could just get another job, or if your boss would just quit, whatever the thing is, we're so sure that if we can just, quote, fix this one thing, everything's going to be good. It'll all be hunky-dory and life will be perfect. And you'll get to the next thing. But now is the seed for next. You don't get to next without now. You don't get to skip over now. Now is how next gets here. And so whatever is here is correct. Whatever is here is the soil and the seed. We think of next as something that we go get, but next is something that we grow, and you can't grow anything if you're always running around and leaving. Now is the seed for next. When we sink into now, the present moment, in a way that's more than just mindfulness-inspired mumbo-jumbo, but when we really have the awareness and the skillfulness to bring as much of ourself, as much of our life as possible into the present moment, the more we become not only the seed which has the codes, but we also become the soil that can bear the codes and care for the codes, the blueprints, the maps for what is next. If you have an acorn or a seed of any kind, you don't have to tell it, by the way, you're an apple tree. And so every day I will come out here and I will just write it down. I'll remind you, I'll set a reminder on your phone so that you know, like on this kind of day, you know that it's time for roots to go down. You'll be dark for this. That's not a thing that's real. Nature is wise. Evolution is wise. Wisdom is wise. They are all alive, breathing things. This moment is a seed for what's next. It knows what time it is. And the more we can empty our backpacks of the stories that are not in alignment with now, the more we're able to become creators, gardeners, storytellers, singers of what the great now is up to and what's really happening and what time it really is and what really is possible. Because now is a portal. Now is a door. Now is not a road trip where you drive to the next. Now is something that you seek into, plant roots, surrender to with deep devotion, heart open, breathing in between. And yes, it has tension. Now and next has tension, not in this pessimistic, dualistic way where we're like, it's a great battle between right and wrong, good and evil, and we are going to win. It's more like a great circle stretching open. A circle has no sides. A circle, the more you apply the tension, the pressure, the wider it gets. And the wider it gets, the more you can hold it and surrender and be in the tension and breathe. The greater the gap is created, the more can come through. It's not about going around the tension. It's not about skipping the obstacle. I promise whatever is the obstacle is the way. Trying to eradicate the obstacle is not the way. It will not happen. I always think of the great demon that Kali Ma was called upon to slay. And every time she chopped off a head, 7 more grew up. 7 more grew up out of the severed head. And so what did she start doing? She started licking up the blood herself so that none of it touched the ground, so that it couldn't procreate, it couldn't recreate, it couldn't duplicate and multiply. Eradicating the obstacle is not it. It's alchemizing the obstacle, which is surrendering to now and trusting that now is the medicine, trusting that what is here is what is needed for the alchemy. We have only to become great practitioners of transformation in order to engage. We have only to become great storytellers. We have only to become more agents of life. We have only to become more synchronized with life, with that writhing snake, with what life wants to do, with what life is up to, which may or may not be in alignment with your current story. Your story might be in the way. Your story might be the obstacle. And step 1 is, it's the obstacle. Let's look at it. Let's go into it. A mundane, silly story I have about this. And I'll start by saying it's annoying when your partner is right. It's annoying when your spouse is correct. But every time I get to a certain place in my work where I feel like I'm bumping up against an edge of growth, I always hit this story about I'm doing it all by myself. I always hit this story of I'm so overwhelmed, I can't do it. I always come up with this story that there's too much on my plate, I can't get to my business. And it's like, there's too much housework. I also help my husband with his business and like, oh, there's too much work there. I have all of these little stories and it's happened enough times now to where I'm like, oh, this is that story coming up. And when I get overwhelmed, I sit down and I open my backpack and I dump it on the ground and just reassure myself that my story is right. But it's annoying when your spouse is correct. and he's been saying for a while that how I respond or how I tell the story or how I allow that to determine how I then act is what's keeping me in a loop. And he's right. Because as soon as I was able to be like, oh, there's that story coming up, And if I do the thing that I've always done with that story, which is be like, it's absolutely correct, let me succumb now to despair and overwhelm, then I already know where that gets me. And so I get to step then into a creative, co-creative role with reality and be like, what if I do this other thing? What if there is actually a skill deficit that I have? What if this thing that I have said is not important, that I don't like prioritizing? What if these things actually are important and I do need to prioritize them? And what if I develop my skillfulness with them, become more of a boss with them, just like I see myself being a boss in this next chapter of my work and my life? What if that is the way? What if it's not the thing in the way? What if it is the way? And that's proving to be correct. When we stop pushing against what is, we begin to be able to collaborate with now, which is the seed and the soil and the story, and then something else is able to emerge. It has its own wisdom, its own timing. It knows what time it is. You can't rush a seed. You can't tell it to become something that it's not. You can't make it a different season than it is. Now is the seed for next. The season is the seed for what's next. And the seed has the whole code. Now has the whole code. You can't skip it. I promise it is wise. It is not something to get around. It is something to engage with, plant into, and begin to weave story. And we can't weave story if we're not listening. A huge part of transformation is quiet, is making space. Pretty much every course I teach, every lead magnet, every offer, every session I do begins with making space. Especially if we have a story that there isn't enough time and we're running out of time. I know that story very well. I'm very good at it. But here's the thing, time is just an experience of where we are in space. The more you make space, the more time there is. Quiet is a part of transformation, and it's a lost skill. And because we've lost skill with quiet, we've lost skill with making space, we've lost skill with listening. I don't mean consuming content, like listening to YouTube videos or podcasts while you're cooking or having ambient noise in the background. Noise is not listening. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean listening to the song of what is. That is something that we can only do if we have made ample space inside of us and we've made room for quiet and allowing it to carve us out in a way that will also widen us as a bowl, as a cup for life. The wider we are, the wider the riverbank, to use that image again from the beginning, the greater the spectrum of experience we can have, and also the more life we can receive. The more of a conduit for life we can receive, and maybe even the greater the interstellar charge we can receive. If you're an antenna who can only receive a very, very small notice, message, or a charge without blowing a fuse, then reality or the universe is actually very kind to only give you a small charge. If you want more space, if you want more life, you need to make more quiet. I know it's not a very sexy transmission. It's not a very sexy advice. Everything in the world right now is saying more and more and noise and noise. But if you notice, if you look, there is also a whole bunch of people. They're being quiet and they're not hanging back. They're just speaking a lot quieter, a lot more spaciously, a lot more softly. And those are the ones who actually have something to say because their antenna, their interstellar Wi-Fi router can take a lot of charge because they've carved it out. In order to be the antenna for the interstellar transmission of now. You have to find that center that is inside of you and not outside of you. Looking outside at the world is never going to make you feel okay. It's never going to make you feel safe. It will never tell you that you have enough money in your bank account. It will never give you all of the affirmation that you need to come into the center of your story. You have to do that. You have to be the center of your story. The outside world is never going to do that for you or to you. And honestly, it would be robbing you of your journey if it did. Now is the seed for next. And it is a short time that we have, both on the scale of humanity. There's a lot of traditions, a lot of people, a lot of stories that are like, now is it for humanity. This window that we're in, some are like up till 2027, some up until 2030, 2032. This is it. Like what we do now is like really it for humanity. And maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. This isn't really about my opinion on that. But either way, it is a short time and it is all the time. Now is not a fixed thing. Now is all the time that we enter when we get quiet and we surrender to be the seed and the soil. When we come into the center, when we stop trying to get to what's next, when we stop pushing against the obstacle, and we really are able to make peace with what is, and then beyond making peace with what is, get excited about what is, really start seeing it for what it is. We see that it is all the time. It is the access to all time in all directions. That is not a straight line. And we might be in a chapter where we're witnessing destruction on a more mass scale, where we're witnessing things falling apart or collapsing. That might be true. And that doesn't mean it's a bad story. That doesn't mean you know where it's going or what it means. What if we opened back to now, opened back to the seed with curiosity and the willingness to be the gardener, the willingness to get quiet and to listen? How does that story want to get sung through you and by you? Not all the evidence that you've accumulated in your backpack that you're so right, so right, so right, and your side is correct, and we should all be freaking out right now. If that's the story, that's not the story. There's another story in there, but you're going to have to allow it to carve you out. Because what's really true, and what I see 99% of the time when I'm working on this with people and really witnessing them in this process, what's really true is two things. One, there's pain and often grief. That's what's really true. The whole story is not true. All the sureties and the arguments and the weaves about what's so correct and which ideology is the best one and it's absolutely yours. All of that is not it. What's really true is that there's pain and that there's grief. What's really true is there's something that deeply hurts about what's happening, and that needs to be grieved. And the story is not helping. The story is maintaining the grief. It's making it stuck. The story is maintaining the pain, and your pain is not your contribution. Your pain is not your contribution. Your pain is getting your attention. And there's a way that another story can be birthed, a new seed can be given, if you will surrender the story, maintaining the pain, and take the journey it's inviting you into to see what gold nugget, what seed could be underneath. The pain may never leave, it might, but everything that's alive changes. And so if it's not changing, it's not alive, it's something old and stagnant and dead. And the other thing that's really true behind the stuck stories is that there's desire. Not only is there pain and grief, that's probably true and hiding under the story, but there's also desire. What's really true is that you desire something else. And desire can be just as hard to sit with as pain, sitting in that gap. Sitting in now and allowing your heart to be stretched open by pain, by grief, by desire, and just sitting in the gap, not going to the store and buying it, because really the thing you desire can't be bought at the store. That will stretch you open. That will be a great practice, and that will definitely weave another story, something really beautiful that wants to get born out of your heart. I had an image a few weeks ago thinking about the relationship between grief and love. And you could perhaps think about this with any seemingly opposite things, but we'll talk about grief and love. And it was this image of someone on a potter's wheel or carving out a bowl or a cup. And the inside hand was grief, and the outer hand was love. Both one hand tenderly on the inside of the bowl, scooping it out, one hand tenderly caressing the outside of the bowl, holding the outside, but also allowing the grief to scoop it out. And the more it's on that wheel, the more skillfully those two hands work together, the wider, the more beautiful, the more true of a bowl, of a vessel that is a vessel for life. And the more you can allow grief and love to carve you open, to open your heart, to be in the tension of now, not with resistance, but with true openness, with breathing, like you would in, if you're thinking about a yogasana pose, for instance, the more you can be in it with true tension, with just the right amount of effort, but also that ease, that breath, that awareness, that reaching, that pulling in and the reaching out at the same time, the more you can be in it with that openness, the greater the gap. The more you will be open and you will feel that opening, but the greater the seed can come through you, the more voltage you can take as an interstellar antennae, and the more creative inspiration you will have, the more alive you will feel, the more life you will receive. It is short time, but it is all the time. Allow life to carve you out with grief, with love. Let it be true that there's something that hurts right now. That's true. But the whole story that maintains it may not be. And allow desire to be true as well. It's true that you probably desire something different, that you can't buy at the store, something that has to arise from within reality. It is a short time, but it is all the time. Which means we not only need supple and strong nervous systems, but supple and strong spirits, supple and strong spines, supple and strong breath. We need quiet. We need space so that we can listen to the supple and strong stories for what is now, from which emerges what is next. It's the only way next gets here ever, which will become the new now. What if now is just one thing that stretches out? Here's what now really means. Anything and everything can happen at any moment, and already has. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a few moments to subscribe to the show, leave us a review, and share the episode. These small tasks help our independent podcast so much. Be sure to also check out the show notes below to learn more about any resources, guests, or sponsors that we shared with you today. Our intro and outro music was created by artists Aaron Palovic and Jared Kelly. Our podcast logo was created by Elaine Stevenson, and this show is produced by Softer Sound Studio. Thank you for being here. Be well. Peace.